Thanks, Kathy. I work in the area of consumer rights, and while we love a good fight for law reform, we often find some of our greatest advances come when we get government and civil society and business working together. So thanks for bringing that perspective to the discussion, because I suspect that the same is often true in human rights as well. I might now invite Ed Santow and the speakers for the next session to join us on stage and take your seats. This next session will dig further into the issues of human rights, the human rights impacts of artificial intelligence. And as they take their seats, I'll remind you that there will be some Q&A at the end of this session. If you haven't already downloaded the Slido app, slido.com, you might want to do that in order to submit questions. Over to you, Ed.
Thank you very much, Alan. As Alan pointed out, we're going to look in this panel at how artificial intelligence and big data are increasingly becoming central to how we make predictions, decisions, and how we live our lives. We've got a stellar panel of human intelligence on display here. Professor Toby Walsh is the Scientia Professor of AI at UNSW and is also a senior member of Data 61. He's a world-leading expert on AI, autonomous weapons, and much in between. Next to him is Jake Lucchi, who's the head of content and AI, public policy and government relations at Google Asia Pacific, based in Hong Kong, where he leads Google's work to use AI for good. And then, of course, Kathy Baxter, who Alan Kirkland introduced us to just now. So, as Alan mentioned, we'll have about 40 minutes of panel discussion with a few minutes at the end for audience Q&A through Slido. Just a reminder, and this will be your last reminder, so you can put questions into slido.com using the name RightsTechAU at any time during the session. You can like particular questions, but it's not a total popularity contest. I reserve the right to ask a question, even if it's not the most popular kid on Slido. And I note that over a dozen of you have already started to put questions in Slido, which is fantastic. And none of those questions asks where I got my snazzy new tie. So you're all very much on message. But first, I'll invite each of the panel members to say some introductory words. And the one thing that I'm going to be brutal about is to keep it really brief. So just a couple of minutes, perhaps starting with you, Toby.
I should start by saying I'm an optimist in the long term. I've spent my whole life trying to build intelligent machines. So it's wonderful the rest of the world is catching up with that dream. But I'm somewhat pessimistic in the short term that we seem to be likely to have a bit of a bumpy road. In fact, it's already very bumpy. I had a bit of a watershed moment in May. I was answering questions from the media about, Google's duplex and the ethical challenge that posed when I started to receive new questions at the same time about Amazon's face recognition software, which was being used at the royal wedding, and concerns about that. And I realized it was a 24/7 job just answering the media's concerns about Silicon Valley's tech fails. And that I needed, we needed to get on top of this because I was running out of hours in my day. Many of those things, I think, are old-fashioned ethical values. The concern that we have about Facebook and Cambridge Analytica is about manipulating elections, and we're worried about that for 3,000 odd years since we started having elections. There's nothing new other than the technology lets us do those sorts of manipulations in ways that are easier, faster, cheaper. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't be worried about them. But there is one thing that AI brings that is, in some sense, completely new. And it goes to what Alan Finkel was saying at the start about this golden rule, which is this idea that AI enables autonomy, machines that can make decisions that impact upon our lives. And like all things with AI, we see the good and the bad. The good is things like autonomous cars. 1 million people die around the planet every year in road traffic accidents. It's in the top 10 most common causes of death. In Australia, it's the 6th most common cause of death. And that's going to go away with autonomous cars. They're going to be so much better drivers than we are. On the other hand, the bad, we see it in things like autonomous weapons. And I've spent a lot of time talking about the challenges, the risks of handing over the decision who dies to a machine. And it's a fundamental human right we're talking about here. It's the right to live. And we really need to get on top of these challenges. So I welcome the fact that everyone else is coming to my party, and look forward to the discussion today.
It's a pleasure to join you. Jake, you want to make some introductory comments?
Yep, thanks, Ed. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. I've just flown in from Hong Kong, taking a red-eye flight, so you'll have to excuse me if I start drooping a little bit during the session, but it's very much great to be here. I thought I would just open with sharing a little bit about why AI is so central to everything that Google's doing nowadays. You may have heard our CEO, Sundar Pichai, say that we're an AI-first company. And for us, we really see making AI for everyone being at the center of almost everything we do. And so that cuts across both the more obvious ways that we use AI in our products and in our services, and also to things like the research that we're doing, trying to apply AI to solving a lot of big problems at scale, which we'll talk a bit more later, but Kathy mentioned a couple of them earlier. And then third, to creating tools that really empower the research community and allow more and more people to take advantage of the technology and participate in it. So for us, we knew for a long time that we had a lot of great work happening around the company that was looking at ways that we can take AI and really apply it for all sorts of socially beneficial use cases. But at the same time, a lot of the concerns that we've heard raised this morning were things that we were also very, very cognizant of, and we recognized that we needed to have a bit more of, one, a set of internal rules of the road to guide the things that we do to make sure that people across, the 70,000-person company that we have a shared framework for understanding what are the human rights implications of AI, what are the challenges, how can we make sure that we're using this technology for good and not using it in ways that raise challenges. And at the same time, to give us a framework for engaging in external conversations, because we recognize that really for the community to come together and solve these problems, we need to have a shared vocabulary. We need to be bringing together people from lots of different stakeholder groups, from government, from academia, civil society, industry. So for us, one of the ways that we felt like it was very important that we could make a contribution was to come up with a set of principles that outline very much what we stand for as a company when it comes to AI. So about 2 months ago, we released our Google AI principles, which both outline 7 things that we're going to try to do. What are we going to try to achieve with AI? What is the reason why we're doing it? And what are we trying to promote? And also created 4 what we call our red lines internally, so things that we're not going to pursue, both with our own development of the technology and application of the technology, and also in terms of how we support third parties in using the technology. And one of those 4 red lines is actually explicitly calls out human rights, that we commit to foregoing business opportunities that would conflict with internationally recognized norms of human rights. And so for us, we've been spending a lot of time thinking about that, building out a governance structure internally to make sure that we're reviewing both all of our internal product uses of AI, but also the ways that we're supporting folks externally as well, to make sure that we're living up to those principles. So I'll stop it there for now, but look forward to diving in deeper on some of those as we move forward. Thank you.
Kathy, some might say you've already had your 3 minutes, but I'm going to give you an extra couple of minutes. And perhaps if you can weave within that, maybe just a reminder for perhaps the Luddites in the room, exactly what do we mean by artificial intelligence?
So artificial intelligence is using the ability to take inductive reasoning, observations. We give a whole lot of data, thousands and thousands of data points to the machine, and it finds patterns in the data, and it continues to learn as it gets more data that comes in. Unfortunately, many of the problems that we see are that the data that the machines are given are biased. We see systematic bias because AI is not neutral. I think that's a very important point to make. AI is not neutral. It is a mirror that reflects back to all of us the bias that's already in our society. And until we can remove bias from our society, we have to take active measures to remove it from the data that feeds and trains AI. And again, that's a very difficult challenge for all of us to have. You can have the best of intentions, but if you aren't able to identify and understand that type of systematic bias, because let's be frank here, the people creating AI today are a very privileged population. They often are not the subject of the Compass parole recommendation system. They are often not individuals that have to live with an AI's recommendation as to whether or not they qualify for social services benefits. And so it's difficult to be able to prevent AI from causing wide-scale impact that violates human rights. We have to take a very active measure to ensure that it is representing and supporting our human rights and not harming them.
So let's wind it back a little bit then. So how can we identify bias before an AI system is deployed in real life? I mean, certainly we've seen, for example, in that compass illustration, how when it's actually deployed and you start seeing the results, then there's clearly a problem. Yes. But before people start to be harmed, so how do we identify it?
There's a research technique called social systems analysis. Some of you might be familiar with values-driven design. It's about creating systems that are in line with the values of the users or the population that it's designed for. But it begins with the assumption that this system will be created, and it's just a matter of how do we create it. Social systems design does not go in with that assumption. It begins by really deeply understanding who it is that we are trying to help, understand their values, and then work out from there. With the Compass parole system, had they done interviews with people that are up for parole, the family members, had they done the research that you showed with that graph of judges making decisions before and after lunch and at the end of the day, I think they would have made very different decisions. One of the factors that's used by Compass is whether or not somebody has served time in jail. Common sense says if somebody served time in jail, they're probably more dangerous, maybe more risky to society. But if you don't realize that people of color are less likely to be able to pay court fines or pay jail or pay for bail, they're going to go to jail. Whereas their white counterparts, who are more likely to be able to pay it, they can basically buy their way out of jail. So again, you have to do this research in advance. You need to understand who's going to be impacted and get a perspective outside of the Silicon Valley bubble or whatever location of bubble you are in.
Thank you. I want to switch gears a little bit. Alan Finkel mentioned right at the start that every country is pursuing AI in its own way. Perhaps you're based in Hong Kong, Jake. Can you tell us a little bit about how China as a country is pursuing AI and maybe what we can learn from this in terms of fundamental human rights protections?
Sure. Well, I can't profess to be an expert on AI in China. There's a lot of activity happening on AI in China, both within the private and public sector. But in general, China has established itself as firmly on the front foot in terms of trying to use AI as a way of meeting its national objectives. And so they've released a very comprehensive national AI strategy that talks about how they want to be a world leader in AI by 2030. They've matched that with a lot of investments and a lot of clear policy plans for how they're going to do that. They work closely with the private sector. So there are things, I think, that we can obviously learn from what China is doing around making those investments, around working on trying to see how AI can be used to deliver public services better in some ways. And there's lots of interesting things happening there. But as well reported in the media, there's also ways that AI is used in China that would, from a Western perspective, raise a lot of questions around surveillance and around privacy issues. And so I think it does raise interesting questions for us as a global community. Whose values are we trying to build in when we talk about AI? So obviously, Google has a set of values around privacy that are not the same as the ones that you might see among a lot of Chinese companies. So for us, we have taken a stand as a company, while at the same time recognizing that there's a lot of other approaches that are taken by companies in other parts of the world, like China, that are world leaders. But for us, taking a very clear stand on what we stand for at Google was the most important thing, and being able to have that conversation wherever we work, whether it be in China or whether it be in the US or in Australia.
Jake, you've described these as interesting questions, and that is definitely one description. Maybe Toby, can you tell us, perhaps focusing on what's known as the social credit score system in a number of Chinese cities, perhaps you can explain what that is and what your views are about that system.
We should be very worried about the social credit scoring system. It started out in some ways quite harmless because unlike the US, they didn't have a credit scoring system of any form, and there's quite a bit of corruption that was going on. So they needed something like the credit scoring system you have in the US. But it went way beyond just simply getting a credit score like you have in the US to being a score for how you behave in life, down to you get a bad score if you have friends who have bad scores. You can't then buy train tickets or plane tickets. It's a huge, great stick and carrot with which to control a population, and so we have to think very carefully about how we act. To go to the question around China, we are actively educating many Chinese students in our universities who are paid for by the PLA. We are exporting technology to China, so we are, in some sense, complicit in supporting those activities.
We in Australia don't have a social credit score system, nor do you have one in the United States. What do you think do you think we're protected against the introduction of a system like that in Western liberal democracies at the moment, or do you think we need to take more steps in order to prevent such a system from being introduced, Kathy?
I do think we have to be vigilant about the use of AI for approving or providing benefits to some while removing it from others. We know that many state and local governments are using AI to make decisions, like, again, who gets access to social services. One of the counties in Pittsburgh, Allegheny County, where Pittsburgh is located, they are using AI to identify children that are at the highest risk of abuse. There are way more reports of abuse than they have investigators, but they're finding that people of color tend to have their children removed from the homes more often than white families. And one of the reasons is that people of color tend to be in the system. There's a lot more data that's known about them because they get more social services as opposed to Caucasian families who may not. There's more of a question mark. And so the more data that a government or a private industry, a private company like Facebook has about you, the more inferences it can make about you, and the more it can have control over what you get access to or do not get access to. So it may not be a nationwide score that is monitored or controlled by any one entity, but I think we can see examples of it proliferating throughout society if there's not something there to limit it and ensure that human rights are being protected.
I just have one word to say: robo-debt. It's a fine example.
Can you add some more words?
We crossed the golden line there, that we were handing over a decision to a machine. No human was involved in the sending out of those letters. And that was impacting upon people's lives. In Australia, as you suggest, we're not probably going to end up with some centralized autocracy like you have in China, but a distributed form in which the machines, the algorithms are given the right to make those decisions without proper oversight is going to be just as bad.
So we briefly stepped into an episode of Black Mirror, and I'm going to shift us a little bit, for a moment at least. Jake, one of the things that sounds really exciting about your job is that it has a particular focus on some of the positive applications of AI, particularly in making our world more inclusive to enhance human rights protection. Can you tell us give us an example of something that really excites you about the development of AI?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of ways in which AI can be used to promote human rights. As you said, Ed, one of the very obvious examples, even from just a product level, are the captioning of videos using AI. So now on YouTube, if you get onto YouTube, you can watch almost any video in the corpus with captions right there. So if you're someone who has any sort of hearing difficulties, it's a great way of immediately having access to a whole world of content that you didn't have before. On the flip side, voice inputs on your phone using natural language processing driven by AI is an amazing tool for folks who might have difficulty seeing, or even for people who are in parts of the world where literacy is a challenge, or where the interface for their language that they speak is very clunky and difficult to use.
Let me just cut you off there briefly, because imagine for a moment an alternative universe where I'm not an amazing expert on science and technology. It is an alternative universe. Can you just explain to us, just in layperson's terms, how does AI unlock those sorts of exciting opportunities? Just walk us through the technology a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the way AI is kind of a complex term. It's used in lots and lots of different ways. So most of what I'm talking about here are things that are driven by machine learning. And the way machine learning basically works is, you give a machine learning system a whole bunch of data, and then you give it a problem. So the data has to be labeled, has to be annotated, so that you know what you're actually looking at in terms of your data set. And then a system identifies patterns within that data. So it's basically just pattern matching. And then you give it a new problem to try to solve and see if it does it correctly. If it doesn't do it correctly, you go back and you try again, but either by making adjustments to your data or by making adjustments to your algorithm, right? And so the way that this is unlocking all these sorts of very important opportunities is by having access to one data now, for example, things like speech, right? So it's able to now identify speech. If we can label particular sounds as words, then over time, the machine learning can learn how to turn those words into text, right? That's just an example from a captioning perspective. But in terms of how this is unlocking so many opportunities now, because there's more data available, also computing power is much cheaper than it used to be, so we have the ability actually to run complex machine learning algorithms. It's really made an explosion in our ability to apply machine learning to lots and lots of problems. That's sort of a basic, I hope, layman's kind of explanation.
I should say, I mean, eventually the technology, we hope, will get even better, that just like our children, you don't actually have to label everything, that it will learn in an unsupervised way. The world doesn't come with labels when we were born, so that we can understand things. We learn those labels ourselves without any examples being given to us. Eventually, the hope is that we'll build methods that can learn just from observing the world like we do.
You're particularly famous for your work on autonomous weapons, or against autonomous weapons, maybe, Toby. But is there something in particular in AI that really excites you at the moment?
I think it's going to revolutionize the way that we deal with medicine. Medicine hasn't been very evidence-based. Doctors give exactly the same treatment to you or to anyone else, to men as to women, which is completely biologically bogus, because men and women have different bodies. And it will be, it will change the way that our healthcare is delivered in a way that will increase our life expectancy and make us live better, healthier, longer lives. It will change the way we deliver government. It will change. You can't think of a business that it won't improve the productivity of. It will improve the education system. Hopefully, the robots will do the 4 Ds: the dirty, the dull, the difficult, and the dangerous.
Just if I could add one thing to that, I think from a human rights perspective on these healthcare cases, it's not only in places like Australia, but some of these advances are really, really important in places like India, right, where you have huge shortages of doctors. So one project that we worked on at Google was trying to diagnose diabetic retinopathy using ML. So basically, this is a disease. If you have diabetes, your retinas can deteriorate and can lead to blindness. And so around 45% of people in India who have this disease already have vision loss by the time it's diagnosed, and it's incurable. This is a problem. It's basically just a shortage of doctors. It's a very easy disease to diagnose and treat if you catch it early. So this is a perfect way that you can take the shortage of doctors, develop an ML-based solution, get retina scans, and then diagnose the disease without even having to see a clinician, and then treat those who have the disease. So it's really, really important in places where medical care is not very accessible yet.
Kathy, what's keeping you up at night? You mentioned a few things. If there's one thing in particular in AI, and perhaps in big data more generally?
I think AI is incredibly complex, but it's something that is becoming more accessible to the broader population. At Salesforce, we are a platform. We make AI available to everyone. We can't see our customers' data. We don't touch our customers' data. It's our promise of trust. And so we need to educate and empower our customers to ensure that they are doing the right thing with our tools. And it's such a quickly changing field. And so being able to ourselves keep up with all of the latest advancements is one challenge, but then being able to empower and keep our customers up to date so that they're always doing the right thing, I think is a huge challenge for us. Everybody has many, many things that they need to do in their day. And a Salesforce administrator, you know, Einstein is just one of many tools that they're having to administer. I'm lucky. I get to think about ethics and AI all day. It's the only thing I get to think about. Not the case for AI administrators. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about how can I create knowledge in digestible chunks for people who they're not data scientists. They are not statisticians. They're not computer programmers. How can we break this down into terms that they can understand and apply so that if they want to do the right thing, they want to employ ethical AI, we make it easy for them to do. And I don't think it's easy yet.
Is that enough? Is it enough that the person will need to want to do the right thing, that they'll want to comply with ethics and human rights standards?
Salesforce has a design system as Google does and many other companies, and one of our mantras is make it easy to do the right thing and difficult to do the wrong thing. And so that is one of the things that we look for with our tools, is how can we put in the guardrails to help customers do the right thing, make it really difficult to do the wrong thing. But again, coming back to the challenges of AI is that context matters. And so gender is generally something that you might not want to include in an AI algorithm because you don't want bias. So an AI administrator might look at their data and see a notification from Einstein saying, wow, the majority of your data are just for men. We see a small amount of data here for women, but you probably want to balance that out. Well, if you're a pharmaceutical company making a drug for prostate cancer, no, it really does make sense. You want to have data coming from men. And so if we were to put in a guardrail and try to say, you've got a problem with your data here, it's not equitably balanced in genders, then we've now created a problem. So again, how can we help our customers when we can't see their data, we don't know the context of the use? And so again, asking the right questions so that they will then go in and dig into their own data, understand it better, and make better choices. Because also we need to help them understand that no one benefits when you're making biased decisions.
There aren't black and white answers to these. These are quite deep societal questions. So in Europe, for example, excuse me, they've decided that you can't discriminate health and car insurance on the basis of gender, which in most countries you still can, because men tend to live shorter, men tend to be worse drivers. And so from a business perspective, it makes sense to discriminate against the sex, whereas in Europe it's been decided that you can't do that. And that's a societal choice. That's nothing to do. The technology enables you to do one or the other, but it's a choice that we as a society make. Women had to put up with their car insurance rates going up in Europe because they have to pay for bad male driving.
But if we don't know the basis on which an algorithm is making a decision, and when I say we don't know on the outside as the person applying for insurance, but perhaps even inside the company, inside the hypothetical insurance company, if you have a machine learning technique that is applying an algorithm and is learning as it goes, it's possible that even the insurance company itself doesn't know what is the basis, and that there may well be a discriminatory basis for making a decision to deny someone insurance. Then don't we have a problem? How do we address that problem? Jake, did you have a view?
Sure. I think that there's a few things that you can do here. I mean, one, I think, is to keep in mind that it's not always essential that you use an AI to make a decision without any kind of human intervention. I mean, there's lots of ways that you can use AI as one input into a human-centered decision-making process. So one thing to think about there is that maybe, if we know, back to the criminal justice context that you mentioned, judges also make biased decisions. AI also makes biased decisions. How can we create a human AI feedback loop that helps to recognize the fact that we need to have more voices who are involved in making this decision? But another thing I think to look at when you're trying to address some of these bias concerns there are some practical tools available to try to understand what's going on, right? So even if you can't always get 100% certainty of how machine learning systems are working, you can identify biases in your data set. There are tools available to do that. We have one called Facets that was developed by a team at Google called the People Plus AI Research Initiative. And this allows you to visualize feature values of your data set to try to understand if there's any biases. Are they overrepresented with one gender or one race, or depending on the use case you're talking about here, to try to understand is there a lack of representativeness in your data set, depending on the problem you're trying to solve. But another is to actually look at the way that your model is working, and you can go back and try to make adjustments to what your model's doing, and you can do that using human-centered processes. So, for example, search is a Google product that we use AI in quite a lot. And so people think, oh, well, the algorithm just feeds everything that I see on search, right? That's true, but we actually have thousands of search raters who go through and test our algorithm every single year, working in languages all around the world, because we recognize the algorithm's not going to perform perfectly. So even in a case like search, where we've been working on this for years and years and years, we have humans test that every year and then make adjustments to our algorithm based on the feedback from these human raters. So that's a way that you can kind of help to make those inputs in.
It's worth pointing out that whilst machines can be very biased, and machines certainly today are not very transparent, humans are terrible. Humans are terribly biased. We're full of behavioral biases, and we're terribly untransparent. You ask people for why they make decisions, and they'll happily invent explanations that don't actually bear reality to how they made the decisions. So the standard's not very high, and hopefully eventually we will do better with machines.
That's right. We're all about improvement. I guess it raises a really important question about how we're going to relate to the computers that are feeding us information. And I'm putting it very neutrally there. Another way of putting it is the computer might be suggesting a decision that we, the human, anywhere from a kind of a decision maker, a junior decision maker in a bank, to a judge. And there's some important issues there. I mean, your work perhaps on autonomous weapons might be instructive here. How do we as humans need to learn how to interact with the computers that are going to be an increasing part of our decision-making processes?
Well, I mean, the good news there is that the machines are going to learn to interact with us. At the moment, you have to learn how machines work. You have to understand and learn the way that they're going to do things. But increasingly, machines are going to learn from us. And just like we don't have to work out how to interact with each other, machines will be there learning how to interact with us. So that's sometimes the human interface is going to become much, much easier, and we'll just be able to talk to the machines and they'll understand us.
That's hopeful. I mean, Kathy, I wonder if you have an idea on this. Certainly in the preliminary work that we've been doing so far, I've been asking decision makers high and low. In your work, if you have a computer, and many people do face this situation, if you have a computer that basically says you should do X, what's your likely response? And the responses tend to cleave to extremes. Yeah. Either the decision maker will say, oh, well, this is a very fancy looking computer. If it says I should do X, then I should jolly well do X. Or they'll say, I don't know what this crazy computer is basing its recommendation on. I'm going to ignore everything that it says. Those extremes seem to me to be worrying in some ways. What's your view?
There was research that was done on the Allegheny Family Screening Tool, AFST, that I mentioned earlier, that they found that there was a human intervention. So the tool would make a recommendation as to how high risk a particular report was and whether or not to send an investigator out immediately. And they found that the particular investigators or the screening, I can't remember the name of the role of the individual that would see and then send out an investigator, they would tend to defer to the AI's recommendation. There's a bit of tech worship that we feel like there's some magic that happens with AI. There was a survey that was done of Fortune 500 CEOs, and they were asking about infrastructure and data, and they found that 97% of the executives survey said that they make daily decisions based on data they know is wrong. A lot of companies are using very old legacy system. There's time delays, it's incomplete, it's not all integrated, but they go in knowing that they should take it with a grain of salt. One of my fears is that the moment they start putting all of this dirty data into AI, they will believe it's cleaned. It's like money laundering, data laundering. And actually, we know that AI magnifies the biases and the errors. But because of the tech worship, there will be this belief that now we can really trust the data. So I think that's a concern that we need to be very aware of when we do have humans in the loop. Are they just going to defer to the recommendation that the system makes because they believe that it's right, or laziness, like we saw with the recession and the robo-stamping in the US, where there was supposed to be a human reviewing whether or not someone's home loan was rejected. They weren't even looking at the applications. They were just rubber stamping them. So we can have humans in the loop, but if we don't put other checks and balances in place, what is the point?
We're just reinforcing the point that humans are terrible at making decisions. This is a failure. This is a failure of humans, that we trust machines too much.
Yeah. I want to move now to some of the questions that are coming through on Slido, and I note that there are already over 80 people who've kind of started putting in their questions or liking other people's questions. And I'm going to paraphrase the most popular question. Australia's Border Force, it's reported, uses an algorithm, or has been using an algorithm, to determine the security risk of asylum seekers. The person who put in the question sought further information using our Freedom of Information law and wasn't able to access it. The fundamental question is, how can we be more aware of the use of algorithms by governments if we can't access the specific algorithms themselves?
So this is one of the really frightening coders to the story about Compass being used for judicial decision-making, is that it's still in use. Despite the fact that there's been all of this publicity about and concerns about it, it's still used in 20 of the 52 states of the United States. And the second thing that hasn't been discussed today as well, which is that it's proprietarial. No one knows exactly how it works. And they've defended North Point, the company that built it, has defended themselves in court as commercial in confidence. And so we don't know. We only know because of ProPublica's investigation and looking at the thing as a black box that it is racially biased. And if that's the standard, we have to be really worried that so many other things will be. Despite all that negative publicity, we're still in a very bad place with that one algorithm.
There's a really interesting question here, particularly for me as a human rights lawyer. We're hearing a lot of talk about ethical frameworks. A number of major corporations are setting up special ethics committees to consider issues like artificial intelligence. But the question, which is, as I say, I think a very interesting one, is that even desirable? One of the concerns that has been raised with us and the UK parliamentary inquiry on AI looked at this as well, is that sometimes this can be a bit of a fig leaf. You set up an ethics committee internally, and then you can say, oh, well, look, we're considering these issues, but really the company just goes on doing what it's always done. And ethics can mean different things to different people. Whereas what we would say at the Australian Human Rights Commission is that that's not true of human rights. I have a whole bunch of ideas that go well beyond what international human rights law says, but my job is a clear one. It is to apply international human rights law here in Australia. So do you think that that's a problem, that we are talking a lot about ethics and perhaps less about something that has a very settled normative content like human rights? Anyone want to take a swing at that?
Yeah, sure. I think that it's both, actually, because there are some ethical issues that don't necessarily present a human rights concern. So from my perspective, you need to do both, right? You need to, obviously, human rights is one where there is a more settled normative context, and so that's why we call that out explicitly in our principles and as one of our red lines. There's also a whole bunch of other ethical things that we talk about that we want to promote, right? That aren't necessarily human rights issues as codified in international human rights treaties, but that are still things that are valuable for us to be considering as a company. So from my perspective, it should really be both. And just to address your other point around, are these just lip service, I do think that these councils can actually play a very, very important role. And we've seen at Google a lot of the internal processes that we're building out really do flag issues. They're blocking deals. But we do also recognize that it's important not just to have internal voices. So we're actually building out an advisory board composed of external third-party experts on, ethicists, human rights experts, people who are from a variety of different geographic backgrounds, as well as a variety of different sectoral backgrounds to help give us that advice, because we don't want to just be looking only at internal voices when we think about how to operationalize these principles.
I think that's fundamental, that we haven't seen yet from the tech industry enough independence and transparency. Despite all the progress we've seen, I applaud the progress that we have seen. But if you compare it to, for example, what I'm allowed to get away with in my university, I have to go through much more thorough, independent and transparent ethical review if I touch humans in any way at all than the tech industry or pretty much any company in outside the pharmaceutical industry. And I think we're realizing that these industries now have a big impact on people's emotional and other lives as much as the drug companies have an impact on our physical lives, and therefore it needs greater transparency and independence for people to have trust.
The next most popular question on Slido has an amusing typo. Australia is the only liberal democracy without a Bill of Rights or a Human Rights Charter or Human Rights Act.
UK?
The UK has one, yep, under Tony Blair. Is this part of the problem? Is that, or to put it more positively, would that be a really important part of the solution, to have, in other words, more comprehensive human rights law protection in Australia? Do any of the external people want to comment on that from jurisdictions that actually have a Bill of Rights?
You can't have enough human rights, so surely the answer is yes. You're the expert here, so maybe I'll ask you the question.
Well, thank you very much, Toby. Look, I mean, I think the Human Rights Commission has been on record for many, many years now, under numerous presidents, in saying that we need to have stronger and more comprehensive human rights law protection. The most obvious way of doing that would be through a statutory Bill of Rights. We're always open to new ideas. That certainly is an ongoing debate.
That's going to remove any ambiguity, make things much more crystal clear as to
It removes some of the gaps, obviously. But from a jurisdiction that has a Bill of Rights, do you want to comment on that, or you can plead the non-lawyer fifth? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, oy vey. I think I would rather defer to you on that one.
Fantastic. Would that everyone did that on every question.
I think one thing we learned from the US is that checks and balances are fantastic, and government, our society should be full of many checks and balances, and human right law is just one of those checks and balances.
Self-driving cars was something that has already come up a couple of times. And in fact, the very first question that came through on Slido before the conference had even started was actually about self-driving cars. And we've got an interesting dilemma that has been suggested here. So if you imagine two people who are jaywalking about 1 metre apart, that's 3 feet, just translating that for anyone. The car has to hit one. That's the physics of it, is that the car is definitely going to hit one of those people. I guess the question is there a way to formulate an algorithm that will make the decision about who the car will hit without relying on bias or without there being any discrimination. Anyone want to take a swing at that?
The street collar trolley, the problem, it comes up constantly. I mean, it's a problem that exists. We deal with this every day. Humans driving have that risk. You know, a dog or a child goes running out in front of us, and we have to make a split-second decision of how do we try to swerve, how do we try to move. You know, I don't think this is necessarily a new problem with AI. We have an expectation that AI is so magical that somehow it can understand who the two people are and that one person is more valuable to run over than another person. I'm not really sure for the people that really love to have that intellectual debate. That's not something I personally spend my time thinking about. I think there are many other issues with AI that are concerning to me.
I mean, you're right, it's an old problem. Philosophers have discussed it for 50 years. But there is a new aspect of the problem, and that's why, in some sense, we're all in this room, which is that unlike the human example of where when you're driving a car, you may face a trolley problem, you don't have to make a decision up front. As a person writing the code, I have to put some values, at least, in that system that makes that decision up front. And that's why the next 50 years is going to be the most interesting 50 years for philosophy, because computers are very literate devices. They will do literally what we tell them to do. And so we have to think in advance how they might behave in situations like that. And then there's a problem at the end that there's no one to be held accountable. So these will be really interesting times for philosophy, because questions that have troubled us for many years, and it's interesting to point out the trolley problem wasn't introduced to describe driving. It was introduced to describe the ethical challenges of abortion. The people you were killing were the mother or the child, and making choices as to those people, which is still a problem that troubles us as a society today. We're still very troubled by the ethical choices we have to make in situations around abortion. So they're not easy answers, but we're making programs and giving them the responsibility, giving them, in this case, the autonomy that they will be making those decisions. Then, as a society, we have to be happy with those decisions.
There certainly aren't easy answers, but I wonder if one new dimension of the trolley bus dilemma is that our tolerance of failure, particularly catastrophic failure where humans are harmed, might be different in respect of a machine as distinct from a human. In other words, we may be more tolerant of a human making a mistake that leads to injury or death on the road than we would be of a machine. Should we be? Is that a rational place that we find ourselves in? Does anyone have a comment about that? Jake, you?
Well, I mean, I think that this does raise very kind of basic foundational kind of philosophical questions around, are you a utilitarian in terms of ethics, and some of these questions that philosophers have been debating for years. So I don't know that I can comment on whether we should or shouldn't. I don't think that the ethicists have settled those questions yet. But I do think, though, that even in the cases where self-driving cars are in some ways making a quote-unquote decision, humans have been the ones who've made inputs into how those decisions are going to be made. They're the ones who've trained the models. So I do think that there's a way in which human values will still enliven the types of decisions that autonomous vehicles make. And so we still obviously have liability frameworks to hold humans accountable, who, the product liability frameworks that we have will still apply in those cases. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, that it's not like humans are suddenly gone completely from the equation when we have autonomous vehicles.
We definitely should hold machines to much higher standards than humans, because because they're machines, they don't have the human failings that we have as humans. They don't suffer from all the errors and mistakes that we make, and so we should hold them to much higher standards because we can.
We've been talking quite a lot from the perspective of governments and companies. One of the questions that's come through from the floor is, what would you advise the humans to do as ordinary citizens? In other words, when it comes to protecting your personal information. There's obviously a big debate raging at the moment in Australia about my health records, but either linked to that or more broadly, what advice would you give to citizens to ensure that their privacy is safe and secure and that they can protect the other human rights that are at play here? Toby?
Yeah, I almost feel bad, but not really, about continued beating up on Facebook. But following a lot of the continuing stories that came out about Uber, there was a massive delete Uber campaign. And the things that were coming out were really terrible, but no actual users of the system were necessarily being harmed. But there was a massive delete campaign. Lots and lots of people deleted Uber. Following Cambridge Analytica, we didn't see that same delete Facebook behavior. I work with many colleagues who will say, I still use Facebook. We know that there just isn't the equivalent. There's Lyft that you can use instead of Uber. There isn't an alternative to using Facebook if you want to truly get off of Facebook. As consumers, we have to be very mindful about who we give our money, our time, our data to. That is, I think that's one of the most valuable things that you can give to a company, is all of the data that it has about you and how it's going to use that information. We've been talking about China and the surveillance of all of its citizens. We surveil ourselves. We take selfies of ourselves and post them on Facebook and elsewhere. Our friends do it, and then they tag us. I don't have a Facebook account, but I know my friends have posted pictures of me on it and tagged me. And at some point, Facebook's AI knows who I am, and they can find me in other photos and know things about me. I haven't given them my permission or any of my data, but they have it. And so as a society, as consumers, we have to take responsibility for what products we've chosen to use, what products we've chosen to give our data to, and how we want to respond to those companies when they violate basic human rights, when they violate our trust. And as employees, we have to decide, who do we want to work for? Is having free M&Ms in the kitchen and all of the other fantastic perks that come with a lot of the companies, does that outweigh some of the things that you might not be so comfortable with your company doing? All of these are things that we have control over individually and as society as a whole, and we really need to leverage that power, and we need to put pressure on our government to do its job and protect us. Even when there are people in power that are worried about upcoming elections and would rather focus on other things, we have to keep pressure on them to do the job that we elected them to do and hold companies accountable when they violate our trust and don't do the basic governance that you would expect a company to do that has as much much data as it does about us.
We've got time for one last question, and Jake, your company has M&Ms in its corporate kitchen, so maybe I'll leave this one with you. We're going to be looking at fake news later in the day, so maybe as a bit of a teaser for some of that discussion, what is Google doing to counter the rise of fake news, and what initiatives are being put in place to ensure that a balance, an accurate range of news sources is available without giving preferences?
Yeah, the fake news one is a really, really tough challenge, and it's one that we have spent a lot of time thinking about as a company, because on the one hand, we recognize that misinformation, even though it's not a new problem, it's been around since the beginning of time, that it is one that has major negative social consequences, but at the same time, freedom of expression and also freedom of the press, and at the end of the day, the ability of anyone to determine at scale what is true and what is false is also a problem that we don't think is very easily solvable. So for us, we kind of are approaching this through three different strategies. One is it's creating more technological tools to give consumers access to information. So for example, we created a fact check tag on Google News and on Google Search that enables publishers, reliable news sources, to then fact check articles that could be either false or problematic, and then you can easily find those on Google Search when you access those articles and say this was fact checked by Politico as mostly true, right? So that's one tool that we're doing, is we're trying to give consumers more and more access to information about news that's out there and choices. Two is around supporting media information literacy. Because at the end of the day, part of this is just consumers and young people knowing that not everything that they read is true. You need to triple check your sources. These are ways that you can do that. And until we have that media and information literacy as a society and think before we share, it's not going to be a problem that we can ever completely solve, right? And then the third piece is amplifying quality journalism. So a lot of traditional news publishers who are creating high quality content, we're trying to support them in getting on into new digital media, getting onto YouTube, for example, trying to support them in making sure that they can get their reliable information up to the top. We've spent a lot of time also improving our algorithms around what signals we use for quality to make sure that the stuff that you see in search, for example, is reliable rather than stuff that could be more fringy. And building into our human search raters that I mentioned earlier, explicitly some criteria around how they can evaluate authoritativeness to make sure that we're getting those proper human signals as well of what is good news and what is not. So we're trying to kind of attack it from all three of these angles.
I think that's a really good teaser for some of the discussion later on today, where I suspect there'll be some quite challenging questions asked in respect of Google and other major companies in respect of fake news. In a moment, I'd like you to join me in thanking our three panellists, Kathy, Toby and Jake. But I first want to foreshadow the fact that we're about to move out to morning tea. We'll be coming back at 11:30. And just a reminder that we have some hard copies of the Commission's issues paper, which is released today in the foyer area. And you can also access the issues paper online at tech.humanrights.gov.au and then click on the word consultation. But please join me in thanking our three excellent panellists.